An African cardinal is upsetting African Christians by condemning the criminalization of homosexuality. Join us with the latest from the Eternal City, Church Militant's Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomes. Jules, for a very long time, Ghana's Cardinal Peter Turkson, who is Chancellor of both the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, was maintaining a diplomatic silence with the Ghanaian government as it was preparing legislation to criminalize homosexual propaganda. Now, however, he's speaking up or speaking out. Jules, what is the Cardinal Turkson saying? Is he supporting or opposing the bill to criminalize homosexuality?
Brad, I first wrote the story on Cardinal Peter Turkson's diplomatic silence when he was prefect of the Dicastery for Integral Human Development. And this was in 2021 when the Parliament of Ghana was discussing this bill to criminalize homosexual propaganda. And, the Ghanaian bishops were very enthusiastic about the bill, as were religious leaders, from Pentecostalism, Anglicanism, and even Islam and other tribal religions. And now, all of a sudden, he's saying something very different. He's singing a different tune. And basically, he was interviewed on BBC Hard Talk a week ago, and he talked about how people need education, more education on homosexuality. Goodness knows what that means. But listen to what he says in the interview.
Now, I referred at the beginning of this interview to Pope Francis and the hopes that were invested in him to show leadership. I would put it to you that on some of these key issues, for example, the Church's attitude to homosexuality, to, for example, the possibility of giving blessing to gay marriages in church, the attitude to the LGBTQ community generally, Pope Francis has sent a confusing, not a clear message.
No, but lately it's about a week or so ago, he came out with a small document, just saying clearly what his position on all of this are. That LGBT people can be blessed, they can be admitted to church, they can, and all of that. They can even, become godparents of children and people who have been baptized and all of that. So he himself has signaled a new pathway, stuff that used to be left in the nebulous and undecided and all. He says now come out clearly with this.
Okay, Jules, before moving on, I want to give you a chance to respond to that statement by Turkson.
Well, it is very interesting, Brad, that he categorically states, almost in a sense, to escape the embarrassing question of the BBC interviewer, that Pope Francis is signaling a radical new direction. And he also talks about how Pope Francis has issued this document. He is interpreting this document on behalf of Pope Francis here, and he's saying, yes, the document does permit priests to bless homosexuals. Obviously, again, we get into this debate about whether they're being blessed as a couple or they're blessed as individuals, but that goes into the realms of sophistry. But however, when Turkson so clearly says that Pope Francis is signaling a new direction, that is something to be very alert and aware of.
Now, this is really sparking outrage among ordinary Christians in Ghana, but are the Ghanaian bishops supporting Turkson?
Well, now that is very interesting because when I wrote the story in 2021, they were very clear. They said in their statement, I quoted this in my story, that they offer, quote, unflinching support for the bill. They also explained that it was not only against biblical Catholic Christian teaching, but it was also against the teaching of every other religion. Christian denominations, other Christian like Anglicans and Pentecostals and Methodists, but also they said that it was against Islam, which is dominant in the debate here, and against the religion of other tribal, and ancestral religions. They also said things like there isn't a single word for homosexuality in African languages. And so we stand with the government, very firmly against this bill. However, now, all of a sudden, after Turkson's statement, they have done a U-turn. And now Archbishop Matthew Gyamfi, who was interviewed, basically said that, well, homosexuality is a moral aberration. We oppose a criminalization of homosexuality. And he quoted Turkson again, but we still support not having it legalized like Western nations, because we don't want it to become part and parcel of our culture.
Now, this sounds very familiar to something that Turkson himself is saying, correct?
Absolutely, yes. And if we listen to, the second part of the interview, you can hear for yourself what Turkson is saying.
LGBT gay people may not be criminalized because they've committed no crime, but neither should this position also become some position, something to be imposed on cultures which are not yet ready to accept stuff like that.
Now, before moving on, first of all, I mean, they're not ready to accept something like that. If they're a virtuous society, you shouldn't, they're not ready to accept it, so don't push it on them. But if they're already, have gone off the rails morally, then it is okay to impose this propaganda. Is that what I'm hearing?
That is indeed what he seems to be saying, Brad, because when he talked about educating the people in the first part of the interview, he said educating them about this phenomenon, and that's the phenomenon of sexuality. Now, what sort of education do we need? Do we need to educate people that, homosexual acts are morally okay, as Western children are being told in schools? Also, he talks about, waiting for a society. In one sense, he's almost implying that his own culture, African culture, is backward, and therefore it needs to be enlightened and come to the, into the shining light of the sexual revolution that has eroded Western society. He did, of course, talk about how Western nations should not browbeat Ghana and other African nations into, accepting the homosexual practice by, for example, holding benefits, financial benefits, and other financial aid that has been sent to these countries.
Yeah, that would be like this colonization, this moral or immoral colonization that Pope Francis has even spoken out against. So what exactly does this bill in Ghana seek to accomplish, Jules, and has it been passed?
Well, it has not yet been passed because there are still a number of, they're fighting over some clauses that need to be changed. Some clauses have been removed from the bill, like the one on intersex people. However, the propaganda from the left is all about, painting the bill as criminalizing homosexual people, which is not true. The bill is called the promotion, the bill for the promotion of proper human sexual rights, and good family values. So what the bill is seeking to do in reality is to prohibit homosexual propaganda in schools or in public by NGOs, particularly Western-funded NGOs, and it is seeking to make sure that people who are abused by homosexual acts, for example, are properly protected. So it's more cultural and protecting family values that most ordinary Ghanaians are very happily on board with.
It seems like there's a middle ground here, Jules, before moving on. You have the homosexual tendencies in a person, LGBT tendencies. Of course, you can't criminalize somebody's tendencies. And it's pushing back against propaganda. That's pushing the activists are pushing this, overtly saying everybody should be gay. But then there's this middle ground, that public expression of homosexuality. You see two guys, kissing at the bus stop and all this type of thing, or other acts that are deemed along, public expression, homosexual acts, which the church clearly says are immoral, and as affirmed even recently are immoral. What about those actions? Does this bill, to the best of your knowledge, address those which would go towards propaganda, popularizing, advocating for, just by the very fact that they're out in public and acting out in a homosexual manner? Does this bill address that in any way?
Well, indeed it does, Brad. And your question reminds me of laws on the public display of sexual acts in Islamic countries. I mean, two homosexuals kissing, for example, just take an example, in Gaza or in Iran, they'd be publicly stoned or thrown off buildings. And in one sense, these laws, as were many Old Testament laws, are for keeping public order. And so if two Western men, a homosexual couple is going to Ghana, they are not going to do this, or going to Dubai, for example, or Saudi Arabia. They are not going to kiss in public because they know the law, and therefore that law preserves public order. Otherwise, there's going to be more violence against them. It will be good for nobody. So a number of Gulf countries, Islamic countries, prohibit adultery, and foreigners often get into trouble and are thrown into jail because of this. So it is very interesting that in the global geopolitical dynamic, it's the poor African nations who are bashed by not just the secular world, but sadly also by the Catholic hierarchy for having these laws, whereas many of these laws already exist in the Islamic world.
Now, you mentioned, Jules, all the voices, the dissenting voices, liberal voices on the left and that. Are these affecting the way politicians are going to cast their final vote on this particular legislation in Ghana?
The voices of Turkson, Cardinal Turkson, and the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Ghana. And, we've had Archbishop Matthew Gyamfi interviewed on radio there and on television there, and he's spoken in favor of, decriminalizing, not having this bill. So, for example, I was listening to an interview with Alexander Afienko Markin, who is a member of parliament, and he's Catholic. And he says, well, now that our Catholic leaders have spoken, Cardinal Peter Turkson, Archbishop Matthew Gyamfi, they have spoken. We will follow their, lead, and we will try as much as possible to prevent this bill from getting passed. And what I am hearing is that Turkson is basically towing Pope Francis's line. I said this in my 2021 article. The Ghanaian bishops, thank God for their temporary boldness. They did manage to hold out for some time, but now knowing Pope Francis is so vehemently against these sorts of laws in the African world, they have, they have buckled. And However, faithful Catholics, ordinary Catholics on the ground, are still standing strong. And if you read some of the comments on Facebook, one Catholic says, hits back at Cardinal Turkson and said, just because you're a Catholic leader, don't think as a Catholic, I am going to listen to what you say. I want this law to be passed.
Well, of course, the condition of having same-sex attraction cannot be criminalized. You can't criminalize someone's tendency. A country can and has, in many, many countries, criminalized, however, the public expression of homosexual acts, and especially propaganda advocating for that, as these denigrate the moral fabric underlying a virtuous society, kind of like outlawing prostitution or even the outlawing of the sale of contraceptives, public indecency and these type of things. So we need to keep in mind that Pope's prudential judgment to tell countries not to criminalize homosexuality is not really covered under Christ's infallibility clause when establishing the Patrine office. We don't necessarily have to command our intellect to think that this papal choice, or choice of words, as confusing as they may be, is really for the greater good of society. Jules, but thank you so much for getting us up to speed on this story and laying out its wider implications for us.
Thank you, Brad.
Thanks again for watching today's episode of Rome Dispatch. This show is brought to you by donors like Real Estate for Life. If you're looking to buy or sell a home and want to support our mission, visit realestateforlife.org. Again, that's realestateforlife.org. Be sure to tell them Church Militant sent you. God bless.